Picture this: the air thick with the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, the cries of warriors locked in a struggle where every heartbeat could be their last. This was the medieval battlefield, a place where fortunes were won and lost in the blink of an eye. But beyond the chaos, something far more profound was unfolding, the weight of decisions that would echo through centuries. A commander's choice to charge or retreat, a king's moment of mercy or ruthlessness, a soldier's split-second bravery. These were the turning points that didn't just decide battles, but shaped the very world we live in today. What if I told you that some of history's most pivotal moments hinged on choices made in the heat of those brutal, dusty fields? From the fog of war emerged stories of cunning, desperation, and sometimes sheer luck, choices so consequential they redrew maps, toppled dynasties, and even altered the course of human civilization. Think of the archer who spared a fleeing noble, unknowingly saving a bloodline that would unite a fractured kingdom, or the general who defied convention, leading a daring night attack that turned certain defeat into legendary victory. These weren't just military maneuvers, they were human moments fraught with fear, hope, and the crushing pressure of knowing that thousands of lives hung in the balance. And here's the remarkable thing: many of these decisions weren't made by kings or conquerors, but by ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. That's the power we're about to uncover: the 26 life-altering decisions made on medieval battlefields that still resonate today. Whether it's a tactical gamble that defied all odds or an act of compassion that softened the harsh edges of war, each story reveals how fragile history truly is. One different choice, and the world as we know it might have been unrecognizable. So join me as we step onto these ancient battlefields, not to glorify the violence, but to witness the moments where human judgment changed everything. By the end, you'll see history not as a series of inevitable events, but as a tapestry woven by choices, each thread a reminder of how courage, wisdom, and sometimes sheer audacity can alter destiny itself. The past is waiting. Let's listen to what it has to teach us. The autumn winds howled across the English coast in the year 1066 as William of Normandy's fleet approached the shore. His army, a mix of battle-hardened knights and reluctant conscripts, faced a daunting reality. Harold Godwinson's forces were rallying inland, and the tides of fortune could turn at any moment. It was here, on the pebbled beaches of Pevensey, that William made a decision so audacious it would become the stuff of legend. He ordered his own ships set ablaze, sending thick plumes of smoke curling into the sky. There would be no retreat, no second thoughts, only victory or death. This wasn't just a tactical move, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By stripping away any illusion of safety, William transformed his army's fear into unshakable resolve. Every soldier now knew they fought not for conquest alone, but for survival. The message to Harold's troops was equally clear. These invaders weren't leaving. Imagine the chilling effect that sight must have had the Normans' own fleet reduced to ashes, a visceral declaration that they'd either win or perish on foreign soil. That single act of calculated desperation tipped the scales long before the first arrows flew at Hastings. The ripple effects of William's gamble are almost impossible to overstate. His victory didn't just swap one ruler for another, it rewrote England's DNA. Norman French blended with Old English to birth the language we speak today. Feudalism took root, reshaping land ownership and power structures for centuries. Even the iconic Tower of London and the Domesday Book trace their origins to this moment. But what's truly staggering is how fragile it all was. Had William wavered, had he left himself an escape route, his men might have faltered when the battle's tide turned against them. Instead, that burning fleet became a symbol of irreversible commitment, proving how one leader's willingness to cross a line in the sand can alter the destiny of nations. Yet history often hinges on such razor-thin margins. As the flames consumed those ships, no one could have predicted how profoundly the world would change because of them. That's the haunting beauty of these battlefield decisions. They remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. And sometimes, the most transformative moments in history begin with a single, irrevocable command: burn the boats. Richard the Lionheart stood before the smoldering ruins of Jaffa's walls in the sweltering summer of 1192, his Crusader army exhausted but victorious. Behind him, thousands of Muslim prisoners knelt in the dust, their fate hanging by a thread. The air was thick with the expectation of massacre. This was, after all, an age where the rules of war often ended at the edge of a sword. Yet in that pivotal moment, Richard made a choice that defied the brutality of his era. He spared them, every single one. This wasn't just an act of mercy. It was a calculated stroke of statesmanship that stunned both allies and enemies alike. While other Crusader leaders urged execution, Richard recognized something far more valuable than vengeance: the chance to earn Saladin's respect. The legendary Muslim commander had witnessed countless Christian leaders break oaths and slaughter captives, but here was a foe who fought like a lion yet ruled with the restraint of a king. The truce that followed didn't just save lives, it created a rare breathing space in the Holy War's relentless grind, allowing pilgrims safe passage to Jerusalem and proving that even bitter enemies could find common ground. Critics at the time called it weakness. Modern historians see it differently. By choosing diplomacy over destruction, Richard achieved what decades of bloodshed couldn't: a fragile but genuine pause in hostilities that let both sides regroup without losing face. The irony is profound. The same man famed for his ferocity in battle secured his most enduring legacy not by swinging his sword but by sheathing it. Saladin, himself a paragon of medieval honor, responded in kind, sending gifts of fresh fruit and snow from distant mountains to Richard's fever-ridden camp when illness struck. These weren't just courtesies between rivals, they were signals that even in war, humanity could prevail. The ripple effects of that decision at Jaffa stretch far beyond the Crusades. It became a touchstone for later generations debating the balance between might and mercy, proving that true leadership isn't just about winning battles, it's about knowing when to stop fighting them. Centuries later, diplomats would cite this moment as evidence that enemies could negotiate without surrender, that honor wasn't the opposite of strength but its complement. And perhaps most remarkably, it showed how a single act of unexpected grace could rewrite the rules of engagement, if only for a fleeting season. In the end, Richard's mercy didn't just spare lives, it planted a seed. One that reminds us, even today, that the loudest echoes of war aren't always left by the mightiest blows, but sometimes by the quietest acts of restraint. The fields of France lay battered and broken after nearly a century of war, when a 17-year-old girl from Domremy stepped onto the stage of history. Joan of Arc wasn't a noble, a trained warrior, or even literate, yet when she stood before the desperate French commanders at Chinon, something in her unwavering certainty cut through their skepticism. She had no battle maps, no strategic training, only an unshakable belief that divine voices had called her to save her homeland. And in that moment, facing seasoned generals who'd known nothing but defeat, she made a decision that would become legendary. She would lead. What happened next defied every convention of medieval warfare. Clad in white armor she'd never worn before, Joan marched straight toward the besieged city of Orléans, the key to France's survival. English fortifications ringed the city, their archers ready to pick off any foolish enough to charge. But Joan didn't strategize like a traditional commander. She acted on instinct and faith, ordering assaults when others would have retreated, rallying broken troops with a conviction that bordered on the supernatural. When she was wounded by an arrow during the fighting, she yanked it out herself and rode back into the fray, her banner flying high. That single act of defiance electrified the French army. For the first time in generations, they fought not out of duty, but because they believed victory was possible. The fall of Orléans wasn't just a military turning point, it shattered the myth of English invincibility. Joan's decision to trust her visions had given France something far more powerful than swords, the audacity to hope. Within months, she'd escort the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation, undoing decades of English dominance. Yet the true miracle wasn't her battlefield success, it was how she'd weaponized sheer conviction. Here was a peasant girl who'd never held a sword before commanding knights twice her age, not through rank, but through the force of her belief. History often remembers Joan for the flames that claimed her, but her real legacy burns brighter. She proved that the most transformative decisions aren't always made in war councils by seasoned tacticians. Sometimes they come from the unlikeliest voices, the ones that refuse to accept the world as it is. In an era where women were expected to be silent, where peasants bowed to nobles, and where France's fate seemed sealed, Joan's choice to step forward rewrote the rules. Centuries later, her story still challenges us. When the world says something's impossible, what unshakable belief might make it real? The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky hills of Hattin in July 1187, as Saladin's forces watched the Crusader army stumble forward, their lips cracked with thirst. For days, the Muslim commander had done something unthinkable to medieval military minds. He refused to fight. Instead, he ordered his cavalry to harass the enemy just enough to keep them marching straight into the waterless wasteland where their heavy armor would become a death sentence. This wasn't retreat, it was a trap woven from patience and perfect understanding of the land. While lesser commanders might have sought glory in a head-on charge, Saladin recognized something deeper. A true victory often comes from letting your enemy defeat themselves. By cutting off access to the Sea of Galilee's life-giving waters, he turned the Crusaders' greatest strength, their heavily armored cavalry, into their fatal weakness. Picture those knights, their chainmail baking under the sun, their horses collapsing as they inhaled dust with every labored breath. The Templars and Hospitallers, Europe's most feared warriors, were reduced to desperate men clawing at dry creek beds. And when the final clash came at the horns of Hatton, it wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. The aftermath reshaped the Holy Land overnight. Jerusalem's surrender months later wasn't just a military outcome, it was the inevitable result of Saladin's masterstroke. But what's often forgotten is how revolutionary his approach seemed at the time. Medieval warfare prized honor and direct confrontation. Yet here was a leader who won not by meeting force with force, but by outthinking his opponents. His tactical withdrawal became a textbook example of how terrain could be weaponized, how environmental awareness could trump sheer numbers. Even his treatment of prisoners broke norms. Where Crusaders had massacred captives after earlier victories, Saladin spared common soldiers, reserving execution only for the Templars and Hospitallers he saw as fanatics. Centuries later, military academies still study Hatton as the moment warfare evolved from brute strength to psychological dominance. Saladin's genius lay in understanding that sometimes the boldest move isn't advancing, it's stepping back to let your enemy's own weaknesses do the work. In an age where retreat was synonymous with cowardice, he redefined it as the ultimate strategic art. the Crusader kingdoms never fully recovered from that July heat, proving that the sharpest swords can't outcut a well-laid plan. And perhaps that's the lesson that echoes loudest when the world expects you to charge. The real power might lie in knowing when to wait. Deep in the Alpine valleys of Switzerland in the year 1315, a ragged band of farmers and shepherds stood between the mighty Habsburg army and their homeland's freedom. The Swiss were outnumbered 5-1, armed with little more than long wooden pikes and a desperate resolve. As the armored knights of Duke Leopold advanced through the narrow pass at Morgarten, confident of an easy victory, the Swiss made a choice that would rewrite the rules of war. They turned the terrain itself into a weapon. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. While medieval battles typically unfolded on open fields where cavalry could dominate, the Swiss exploited every inch of the cramped mountain pass. When the Habsburg knights, their heavy horses struggling on the steep slope, entered the killing zone, the peasants unleashed a hailstorm of boulders and logs from above. Then came the pikes, not wielded as individual weapons, but as a unified wall of death. Picture those 14-foot shafts, their iron tips glinting as hundreds moved in terrifying unison, turning a ragtag militia into an unstoppable human thresher. The tightly packed Habsburg forces had no room to maneuver, no chance to rally. In less than an hour, the Swiss had done the impossible. They'd shattered the myth of knightly invincibility. The shockwaves of Morgarten reached far beyond the Alps. For centuries, warfare had been dominated by wealthy nobles who could afford armor and war horses until a bunch of determined peasants proved that discipline and innovation could trump social status. The Swiss didn't just win a battle, they birthed a new era of infantry dominance. Their pike formations, refined over the next century, would become the blueprint for armies from the German Landsknechts to the Spanish tercios. Even the famed Macedonian phalanxes of antiquity hadn't achieved this level of coordination with such simple tools. What made the Swiss truly revolutionary wasn't just their tactics, it was their mindset. They fought not as subjects, but as citizens defending their communal freedoms, and that fierce independence infused every thrust of their pikes. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Morgarten lies in its defiance of the inevitable. Against all logic, against all precedent, a group of nobodies redefined what was possible through sheer ingenuity and unity. Their victory didn't just preserve Swiss autonomy, it whispered a dangerous truth to every oppressed people across Europe. Power isn't always where tradition says it should be. Sometimes it's in the hands of those clever enough to turn their weaknesses into strengths and brave enough to stake everything on a single, unconventional idea. The echoes of that Alpine ambush still resonate today, reminding us that the most formidable force in history isn't wealth or title, but the unstoppable will of those who refuse to accept defeat. The fields near Poitiers shimmered in the September heat of 1356 as Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, surveyed the horizon. What he saw would have made most commanders retreat, a sea of French banners stretching as far as the eye could see, their armored knights outnumbering his exhausted English forces nearly 3-1. But the 26-year-old prince made a choice that defied every aristocratic instinct of his era. He ordered his knights to dismount, handing their prized war horses to the rear guard. They would fight on foot, shoulder to shoulder with common archers, turning the medieval world's social hierarchy upside down in one bold stroke. This wasn't just desperation, it was tactical genius. The French nobility, confident in their chivalric traditions, expected the English to either flee or meet them in a glorious cavalry charge. Instead, they found a wall of disciplined longbowmen sheltered behind natural obstacles, their deadly arrows already nocked. As the French knights advanced through narrow lanes between marshes and hedges, their formation fractured. Then the sky darkened with English shafts, each yew longbow launching arrows capable of piercing armor at 200 yards. The result wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. By day's end, France's finest lay in tangled heaps, their king captured, their pride shattered. What made Poitiers revolutionary wasn't just the victory, but how it was achieved. Medieval warfare had always been dominated by the mounted knight, the tank of its day, yet here was a prince willingly abandoning that advantage. Edward understood something his opponents didn't. True leadership meant adapting to the moment, not clinging to tradition. His decision to fight alongside low-born archers sent shockwaves through Europe's nobility. Suddenly, the peasant with a longbow wasn't just support, he was the backbone of victory. The aftermath reshaped warfare forever. Within decades, the longbow became England's great equalizer, its dominance lasting until gunpowder changed the game. But Poitiers' real lesson runs deeper. It showed that the most dangerous thing in war isn't overwhelming odds, it's rigid thinking. While the French saw only how battles should be fought, Edward saw how they could be won. His willingness to break convention didn't just secure a kingdom. It proved that sometimes the bravest move isn't holding your ground, it's daring to stand differently. Dawn broke over Constantinople on April 22, 1453, revealing an impossible sight: 70 Ottoman warships glinting in the morning sun, now floating in the Golden Horn behind the Byzantine defensive chain. For weeks, that massive iron barrier had thwarted Mehmed the Conqueror's naval assault, rendering half his fleet useless against the ancient city's sea walls. But the 21-year-old Sultan refused to accept stalemate. In a move that defied both physics and expectations, he'd orchestrated history's most audacious portage operation under cover of darkness, greasing logs with animal fat to slide his galleys over a mile of land. This wasn't just a logistical feat, it was psychological warfare at its most brilliant. Imagine the terror of Byzantine defenders waking to find their impregnable harbor suddenly swarming with enemy sails. The chain hadn't been broken, it had been rendered irrelevant. Overnight, Mehmed had transformed the entire strategic landscape, forcing Constantinople's outnumbered garrison to divide their forces between multiple fronts. His cannons, including the massive bombard called Basilica that could fire 1,200-pound stones, now had new angles to pummel the battered Theodosian walls. But the real masterstroke was in the timing. By coordinating the naval maneuver with intensified land assaults, Mehmed stretched the defenders to their breaking point, proving that innovation could outmaneuver even 1,000 years of defensive engineering. The ripple effects of that single night still shape our world. Constantinople's fall didn't just extinguish the last ember of the Roman Empire, it supercharged the Ottoman ascent into a global power. The city's libraries, its scholars fleeing westward with precious manuscripts, helped spark the Renaissance. Meanwhile, European kingdoms, suddenly confronting an Islamic superpower on their doorstep, began desperately seeking new trade routes, accidentally stumbling onto the Americas in the process. Yet what's often overlooked is how narrowly this hinged on Mehmed's willingness to attempt the absurd. Most commanders would have seen the chain as an immovable obstacle. He saw it as a challenge to outthink. There's a lesson here that transcends medieval warfare about the power of refusing to play by assumed rules. Mehmed's gambit reminds us that the barriers we think are permanent often just require a fresh perspective to circumvent. His ships didn't sail around the chain, they went over it, rewriting the playbook for siege warfare in the process. Centuries later, that moonlit hall still stands as testament to one of history's great truths. The difference between impossible and legendary often comes down to one leader's willingness to try what no one else would dare. Rain lashed the fields of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, turning the ground into a sucking quagmire where armored men would soon drown in mud as easily as blood. Henry V's army, haggard from dysentery, outnumbered nearly 5-1, faced annihilation by France's glittering aristocracy. Most kings would have relied on threats or promises of plunder to motivate such desperate men. But Henry chose a different weapon, words. What followed wasn't just a speech, it was alchemy, transforming fear into something unbreakable. "You know how to make an English longbow sing," he told his archers, muddy hands gripping their yew staves. "But today, let the French hear your voices roar." This was revolutionary. Medieval commanders rarely addressed common soldiers as equals, let less inspired them. Yet Henry, crown glinting under his battered helmet, spoke not of obedience but of shared destiny. "We few, we happy few," he called them, binding their fates together with a phrase that would echo through centuries. The genius wasn't in the poetry alone, it was in the psychology. By emphasizing their small numbers, he turned weakness into strength. By calling them band of brothers, he made every man feel indispensable. The result defied logic. When the French cavalry charged through the morass, their heavy armor became a death sentence. English arrows turned the sky black, but it was Henry's words that had already stiffened spines. Men who hours earlier could barely stand from illness now fought like demons, knowing their king believed in them. The staggering casualty ratio, nearly 10,000 French dead to a few hundred English, wasn't just tactical superiority. It was the multiplier effect of morale, proof that conviction can outweigh numbers. Yet the true brilliance of Henry's choice lies in its lasting impact. Shakespeare's immortal, "Once more unto the breach," speech is fiction, but the real Agincourt oration achieved something rarer. It showed that leadership isn't about issuing orders, but igniting belief. In an age where kings ruled by divine right, Henry demonstrated that real authority comes from understanding human hearts. Centuries later, military academies still teach his lesson. The most powerful weapon on any battlefield isn't steel, it's the ability to make ordinary people believe they're capable of the extraordinary. What makes Agincourt timeless isn't the mud or the arrows, but that fleeting moment when a rain-soaked king reminded the world that wars are won not just with hands, but with the fire that moves them. And perhaps that's the decision that resonates most, choosing to lift others up when all seems lost, because sometimes the right words at the right time can change history as surely as any sword. Acre's harbor churned with panicked ships in the spring of 1291, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land crumbling under the Mamluks' relentless assault. Amid the chaos, a handful of Templar knights faced an impossible choice: board the waiting galleys to safety or turn back into the inferno. They chose neither. Instead, these warrior monks did something that defied the logic of self-preservation. They formed a human shield at the city's collapsing gates, buying precious minutes for women, children, and wounded soldiers to scramble onto departing vessels. This wasn't just bravery, it was a deliberate rewriting of their order's legacy. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had been Europe's most feared fighting force, amassing wealth and influence that rivaled kings. Yet in their final hour, they wielded that power not for conquest, but for something far more subversive: radical compassion. Picture those crimson-crossed knights, their white mantles streaked with soot and blood, standing shoulder to shoulder as Mamluk sappers undermined the walls beneath them. They knew Acre was lost. They knew this act would doom their ancient brotherhood. But in choosing to die for strangers rather than live as legends, they distilled the essence of chivalry into a single, shimmering moment. The aftermath was as tragic as it was transformative. Within weeks, the Templar stronghold at Cyprus received word that only 7 brothers had survived the carnage. The Order's vast network of castles, banks, and political connections would soon crumble under persecution, yet something unexpected happened. Stories of their last stand spread like wildfire through Europe's taverns and courts. Even their fiercest critics couldn't ignore the stark poetry of history's wealthiest warriors, spending their final coins not on mercenaries, but on hiring every available fisherman to evacuate civilians. What makes Acre's fall so haunting isn't the military defeat. It's the revelation that legacy isn't written in victories alone. The Templars' choice reminds us that how an institution ends can redefine how it's remembered. Centuries later, their tale challenges our modern obsession with self-interest. When the walls are collapsing around you, what will you clutch tighter, your life or your principles? Their answer, etched in the dust of that forgotten harbor, still whispers across the ages. True honor isn't about how you wield power when you're strong, but how you spend it when you're doomed. The grasslands along the Kalka River seemed to tremble under the weight of thousands of Rus and Cuman warriors as they charged forward in the summer of 1223, their battle cries mingling with the thunder of hooves. Before them rode what appeared to be a broken Mongol force, Subutai and Jeeb's elite horsemen fleeing in panic, their formation dissolving into chaos. It was the moment the Rus princes had dreamed of. The legendary steppe warriors finally routed, but the truth was far deadlier. Every seemingly disorganized retreat had been meticulously choreographed, every feigned stumble a step in history's most lethal dance. This wasn't just a tactical withdrawal, it was psychological alchemy. The Mongols had perfected the art of turning their enemies' greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. By appearing vulnerable, they ignited the Rus' forces' thirst for glory, luring them away from their defensive positions into open terrain where Mongol mobility reigned supreme. Imagine the dawning horror as those pursuing knights suddenly found themselves exhausted, strung out over miles, only to hear the shrill whistles of Mongol arrows slicing through the air from all sides. The retreating horsemen had pivoted seamlessly into a circular formation, their famed composite bows picking off targets with clinical precision while fresh Mongol reserves closed the trap. What made Kalka River revolutionary wasn't the feigned retreat itself, a tactic as old as warfare, but the scale and coordination of its execution. Subutai and Jeeb didn't just trick a battalion, they ensnared an entire coalition army, including some of Europe's most experienced commanders. The aftermath was apocalyptic. Rivers ran red with noble blood, captured princes crushed beneath wooden platforms during the Mongols' victory feast. Yet the real lesson wasn't in the brutality, it was in the sophistication. While medieval European warfare prized straightforward clashes of honor, the Mongols demonstrated that wars could be won long before blades crossed in the theater of the mind. The echoes of this deception ripple through military history. Napoleon would later employ similar tactics at Austerlitz, and modern special forces still study Subutai's campaigns. But Kalka's deeper legacy lies in its defiance of conventional wisdom. In a world that equates strength with visibility, the Mongols proved how much power resides in the shadows, how letting your enemy believe they've already won can be the ultimate weapon. Their greatest victory wasn't on the battlefield that day, but in the moments before, when they convinced proud warriors to willingly march into oblivion. Centuries later, it stands as a chilling reminder. Sometimes the most dangerous foe isn't the one who stands their ground, but the one smart enough to let you think they've fled. The moon hung low over Stirling Bridge on the night of September 10, 1297, its pale light glinting off the restless waters of the Forth. Beneath that silver glow, shadows moved with silent purpose. William Wallace and Andrew Moray's makeshift army of Scottish spearmen and farmers, their faces smeared with mud to mute any stray reflection. Across the river, the English camp slept soundly, confident their heavy cavalry and disciplined longbowmen made them invincible. That arrogance would cost them dearly before dawn. Wallace and Moray's decision to attack under cover of darkness wasn't just bold, it was a masterclass in exploiting an enemy's blind spots. Medieval warfare followed unspoken rules. Battles happened in daylight, on open ground, where noble knights could display their heraldry and prowess. By shattering those conventions, the Scots turned the English army's greatest strength, their rigid hierarchy, into a fatal liability. Picture the chaos as sleeping soldiers woke to the screams of their comrades. The narrow bridge they'd assumed was their lifeline, now a death trap where armored knights floundered in the shallows, their horses panicking in the press. The Scots, armed with nothing but long spears and intimate knowledge of the boggy terrain, funneled the English into a killing zone where numbers meant nothing. What made Stirling Bridge revolutionary wasn't just the victory, it was the blueprint it created for asymmetric warfare. Wallace understood something his opponents didn't. Sometimes the mightiest sword is the one your enemy never sees coming. While English commanders obsessed over chivalric codes and formations, the Scots fought without rules, leveraging darkness, terrain, and sheer unpredictability. Their triumph proved that a well-timed strike against a distracted foe could achieve what years of open rebellion couldn't. The psychological impact was seismic. For the first time, Scotland's common folk saw that the English war machine wasn't unstoppable, just vulnerable to those brave enough to hit where and when it least expected. Yet the true genius lay in the aftermath. Wallace and Moray didn't just melt back into the hills, they capitalized on their momentum, seizing Stirling Castle and igniting a fire of resistance across the Highlands. That night raid became legend not because it won a battle, but because it rewrote the playbook for how underdogs could wage war. Centuries later, special forces still study its lessons. Victory often goes not to the strongest army, but to the one that dares to fight on its own terms. In the end, the bridge at Stirling stood as more than a crossing. It became a symbol, reminding us that history's greatest upsets often begin when someone decides the cover of darkness isn't for hiding but for striking. The Duke of Burgundy rode through the torchlit camp outside Orléans in the bitter winter of 1429, his breath curling in the frigid air as he weighed a decision that would tip the scales of history. For months, his Burgundian troops had fought alongside their English allies, tightening the noose around the besieged city. But now, whispers reached him tales of a peasant girl from Domremy rallying the fractured French forces, her fervor igniting something long dormant in the hearts of his countrymen. With a single command, he could prolong the siege and secure Burgundy's English-backed fortunes, or he could do the unthinkable, withdraw. What happened next wasn't just a tactical retreat, it was a seismic realignment of medieval power politics. Burgundy's forces didn't merely pack up their siege engines, they melted away like frost under morning sun, leaving the English flank exposed. Overnight, the balance shifted. Joan's ragtag army, once pinned between the English anvil and Burgundian hammer, found breathing room to strike. The siege lines that had held for half a year began to crumble, not from assault, but from the silent erosion of trust. This betrayal cut deeper than any sword. The Anglo-Burgundian alliance had been the cornerstone of English dominance in France for nearly a generation, a marriage of convenience between Henry V's heirs and Burgundy's ambitions. Yet in the end, it took just one girl's divine mission to remind the Duke where his true loyalties lay. The irony was exquisite. Joan never swung a blade at Burgundy's men. Her weapon was far more potent, the unshakable belief that France, divided for so long, could still be one. The lesson echoes far beyond those medieval walls. Burgundy's choice reveals a truth as old as warfare itself. Alliances built on opportunism rather than shared purpose are castles on sand. Modern diplomats still study this moment, not for its battlefield tactics, but for its stark reminder that in war, the most dangerous fractures aren't always in fortress walls, they're in the fragile bonds between uneasy partners. Joan's miracles at Orléans might have inspired the masses, but it was Burgundy's cold calculation that truly broke the siege. And perhaps that's the darkest twist of all, that history's turning points sometimes hinge not on heroism, but on someone's quiet decision to stop fighting for the wrong side. The waters of the Bosporus churned with panic in the summer of 717 as the Umayyad fleet closed in on Constantinople's sea walls. 800 Arab warships filled the horizon, their sails blotting out the sunset, a force so vast it seemed the Byzantine Empire's final hour had come. But Emperor Leo III had one last card to play, a weapon so terrifying its recipe would remain a state secret for centuries. With a single command, he unleashed hell itself upon the waves, loosed the fire ships. What happened next wasn't just a battle, it was an inferno. Byzantine dromons fitted with bronze siphons spewed jets of liquid flame across the water, the mysterious Greek fire clinging to wood and flesh alike, burning even beneath the waves. Arab sailors leaped screaming into the sea only to find the fire followed them, the very water aflame. Panic spread like the blaze itself, ships colliding in their desperation to flee, the once proud fleet reduced to floating pyres. By dawn, the strait resembled a scene from ancient prophecy-charred hulls, smoke staining the sky, and the stunned survivors whispering of sorcery. The true genius of Leo's decision lay not in the weapon's brutality, but in its timing. For weeks, he'd let the Arab forces grow complacent, their blockade tightening as they underestimated the besieged city. Then, when the wind and tide aligned perfectly, he struck with precision worthy of a surgeon. This wasn't just about deploying a secret weapon, it was about orchestrating the perfect moment for maximum psychological devastation. The Arabs hadn't just been defeated, they'd witnessed something that defied all laws of nature, leaving them convinced the Byzantines commanded divine forces. Greek fire's impact rippled far beyond that summer night. Constantinople would endure another 7 centuries, becoming Europe's bulwark against Eastern conquest. The failed siege marked the beginning of the Umayyad dynasty's decline, shifting the balance of power in the Mediterranean forever. Yet what's often overlooked is how this moment redefined the very nature of warfare. Leo hadn't just used a new weapon, he'd demonstrated how technological secrecy could be as formidable as armies. The mystique surrounding Greek fire became its own deterrent, with generations of enemies hesitating to test Byzantine naval might. There's a haunting lesson in those flames. In an era where most battles were won by numbers or brute strength, Constantinople's survival hinged on something far more fragile: human ingenuity. That secret formula, guarded like the empire's soul, reminds us that sometimes the thin line between extinction and endurance isn't drawn in steel, but in the spark of an idea. And perhaps that's the fire's true legacy, proof that when faced with annihilation, the boldest answer isn't always to match force with force, but to light a blaze so terrifying it sears itself into history's memory. The royal treasury lay nearly empty when the French nobility gathered in Paris after Poitiers, their king imprisoned, their army shattered. John II's capture should have been a crisis with a clear solution. Medieval custom demanded his ransom be paid without question. But the council's hesitation stretched from weeks into months, their debates growing more frantic as England's Edward III named an astronomical sum, 3 million gold crowns, twice France's annual revenue. What followed wasn't just procrastination, it was a masterclass in how inaction can unravel a kingdom thread by thread. While commoners starved under wartime taxes and marauding companies of unemployed mercenaries, The so-called free companies pillaged the countryside. France's lords bickered over who should bear the financial burden. The Dauphin Charles, barely 19 and untested, faced an impossible choice: drain the realm's coffers to free his father, or let the monarchy's authority wither further. His indecision became its own kind of verdict. For 4 long years, John languished in the tower of London's gilded cage, his letters home pleading for resolution met with silence. The delay wasn't merely embarrassing, it signaled something far more dangerous to France's fractured nobility. A crown that couldn't protect its king couldn't protect anyone. The consequences rippled outward like cracks in thin ice. Provincial governors, sensing weakness, began acting as independent rulers. Paris merchants revolted under the weight of emergency levies. Even the church, traditionally the monarchy's staunchest ally, withheld funds, fearing the money would vanish into Edward's coffers without securing peace. Meanwhile, England's position hardened. Why negotiate seriously when France's paralysis only strengthened their hand? The Treaty of Bretigny, when it finally came in 1360, wasn't just costly, it was humiliating. Beyond the staggering ransom, France surrendered nearly a third of its territory, including the vital port of Calais. Yet the true tragedy lay deeper than lost land or gold. John's eventual return to London, a voluntary act of chivalry when hostages escaped, revealed how profoundly the delay had broken something essential. A king who'd once commanded respect now seemed a pawn in others' games, his sacrifice noble but futile. The lesson echoes through time. Power abhors a vacuum. Whether in medieval courts or modern boardrooms, hesitation rarely preserves stability, it invites chaos. France's paralysis didn't just prolong the 100 Years' War, it proved that sometimes the most catastrophic decisions aren't the ones we make, but the ones we're too afraid to confront. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the fields of Grunwald on that fateful July day in 1410, obscuring the true scale of the forces gathering against the Teutonic Knights. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen surveyed what he believed to be yet another ragtag coalition of Poles and Lithuanians, peasants and pagans, who'd crumple before his disciplined brotherhood. His scouts had warned of something different this time: hidden reserves, unconventional tactics, a trap being set. But 2 centuries of victories had calcified into certainty. With a flourish of his banner, he gave the order that would unravel his order's dominance. Forward in the name of Christ and glory. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was the shattering of an illusion. The Polish-Lithuanian forces, led by King W. Ladislaw Jagiello, didn't fight like the disorganized tribes the knights had crushed for generations. They fought like architects of a new era. Lithuanian light cavalry feigned retreat, luring the overeager Teutonic heavy knights into a killing zone where Polish infantry waited with hooked spears designed to drag riders from their saddles. Meanwhile, the knights' own mercenary allies, sensing the tide turning, abandoned their posts mid-charge. Within hours, the Brotherhood's legendary discipline dissolved into chaos, their Grand Master's body lost somewhere in the carnage. The disaster at Grunwald exposed a fatal flaw in the Teutonic worldview. Their entire identity had been built on the belief that divine favor and martial superiority were inseparable. Yet here, against an army they dismissed as inferior, they learned too late that adaptability trumps tradition. The Lithuanians, once seen as primitive for their hit-and-run tactics, now demonstrated how mobility could neutralize brute strength. The Poles, mocked for their decentralized command structure, proved how flexibility could outmaneuver rigid hierarchy. Far beyond the battlefield, the consequences rippled across Northern Europe. The Teutonic Order never regained its aura of invincibility, its territories shrinking like ice under spring sun. Meanwhile, the Polish-Lithuanian Union emerged as a rising power, its multicultural army a blueprint for the future. But Grunwald's real lesson isn't about military tactics, it's about the peril of mistaking past success for future inevitability. The knights didn't fail because they were weak, they failed because they couldn't imagine being anything but strong. There's a haunting relevance to their story today. Whether in boardrooms or battlefields, the moment we stop questioning our assumptions is the moment the ground begins shifting beneath us. The Teutonic banners lying trampled in the mud at Grunwald whisper a warning across 6 centuries. No empire, no institution, no ideology remains dominant forever. The only true constant is change and the humility to recognize when the old rules no longer apply. The rolling fields near Crecy shimmered under the August sun in 1346, the air thick with the metallic scent of impending rain and bloodshed. Edward III's English army, exhausted from weeks of forced marches, now faced the flower of French chivalry, thousands of armored knights gleaming like a steel tide. But Edward didn't order his men to brace for a desperate last stand. Instead, he made a choice that would echo through military history. He positioned his Welsh and English longbowmen at the front, their unstrung bows resting against muddy boots as they waited. This wasn't just a tactical adjustment, it was a declaration that the age of mounted nobility was over. When the first French cavalry charge thundered forward, the sky turned black with arrows. Each yew longbow, taller than the archers themselves, launched shafts capable of piercing armor at 200 yards, a storm of death arriving faster than knights could react. The result wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. Horses screamed as arrows found gaps in their barding, throwing riders into the churned earth where they floundered under the weight of their own plate armor. Repeated charges met the same fate, the slopes becoming a ghastly tangle of fallen nobles and panicked steeds. By nightfall, the myth of knightly invincibility lay broken alongside the bodies of 11 princes and over 1,000 French nobles. What made Crecy revolutionary wasn't just the longbow's lethality. It was Edward's willingness to stake everything on a weapon wielded by commoners. Medieval warfare had always been dominated by the aristocratic elite, their expensive armor and warhorses symbols of divine right to rule. Yet here was a king who entrusted his fate to peasants and shepherds, their calloused hands proving deadlier than any noble sword arm. The longbow didn't just kill knights, it undermined the very social order that placed them atop the battlefield and society. The aftermath rippled far beyond France. Within decades, every English village green became a training ground, boys as young as 7 practicing daily to develop the inhuman strength required to draw a war bow. The longbow became England's great equalizer, its dominance lasting until gunpowder changed the game. But Crecy's real lesson runs deeper than military technology. It revealed how quickly the tides of history can turn when someone dares to question tradition. The French didn't lose because they lacked courage. They lost because they couldn't imagine a world where the rules had changed. Edward's genius lay in recognizing that truth before anyone else. Sometimes progress doesn't whisper, it screams from a bowstring. The muddy fields near Sudoma in the spring of 1420 might have seemed an unlikely place for military revolution until Jan Žižkov's ragtag Hussite rebels rolled out their secret weapon. Not towering siege engines or gleaming armor, but ordinary farm wagons lashed together with chains, their sides reinforced with wooden planks. To the approaching royalist knights, it must have looked like a peasant's feeble attempt at defense. They would soon learn otherwise. Žižkov's decision to transform these humble wagons into movable fortresses wasn't just tactical genius, it was survival incarnate. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Hussites had one advantage: their enemies still fought by the old rules. When the cavalry charged, expecting to scatter the rebellious farmers like chaff, they instead met a wall of wagons bristling with hooked pikes and early handguns called pistolas. The knights' momentum became their downfall as horses impaled themselves on the barriers, their riders dragged down by Hussite flails, modified farming tools that could crush armor like eggshells. Meanwhile, from the safety of their makeshift forts, the rebels unleashed volleys of crossbow bolts and stones from makeshift catapults, turning the wagons into lethal firing platforms. What made the wagon forts revolutionary wasn't just their effectiveness, it was their flexibility. Unlike stationary castles, these mobile strongholds could advance or retreat with the battle's ebb and flow. Agincourt, the brilliant one-eyed commander, arranged them in circles or squares depending on terrain, sometimes leaving deliberate gaps to funnel attackers into killing zones. His innovation went beyond hardware. It redefined battlefield psychology. The Hussites sang hymns as they fought, their wagons serving as both physical and spiritual bulwarks against oppression. For the first time in European warfare, commoners held the tactical high ground against mounted nobility, not through brute strength, but through sheer ingenuity. The ripple effects of Soudema reshaped Central Europe for decades. The Hussites, once dismissed as heretical upstarts, became nearly invincible in open battle, their wagon forts rolling across Bohemia like righteous tidal waves. Kings and popes sent crusade after crusade to crush them, only to watch their expensive armies founder against these adaptive defenses. Even after Agincourt's death, his successors refined the tactics, adding small cannon to the wagons, an early glimpse of the artillery warfare that would dominate future battlefields. Yet the true legacy of those clattering wagons lies deeper than military innovation. They stand as testament to a profound truth. When the powerless refuse to play by the rules of the powerful, history bends. Agincourt didn't just invent a new way to fight, he proved that imagination could level the playing field, that a plowshare beaten into a flail could topple empires. 6 centuries later, his lesson still resonates. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in having the mightiest weapons, but in seeing the battlefield and the world differently than those who claim to own it. The jagged peaks of the Picos de Europa loomed like silent sentinels in the summer of 718, their steep slopes offering scant refuge to the ragged band of Visigothic nobles and peasants huddled in the caves above Covadonga. Below them, the Umayyad governor Munuza dispatched a detachment of seasoned warriors enough to crush this minor rebellion in an afternoon, or so he thought. Pelagius, the exiled noble leading the resistance, faced a choice that seemed suicidal: stand and fight in that treacherous mountain pass, or scatter his people to the winds. His decision to plant his banner on that rocky ground didn't just defy logic, it ignited a flame that would burn for centuries. What unfolded in that narrow defile was less a battle than an act of divine defiance. Pelagius' 300 fighters, armed with little more than hunting spears and slings, rained stones and arrows down on the advancing Muslim forces from the cliffs above. The Umayyads, accustomed to open field battles where their cavalry dominated, found themselves trapped in a lethal funnel, their numbers meaningless against the crushing weight of falling boulders and the sudden, vicious ambushes from hidden caves. By day's end, the pass ran red with the blood of would-be conquerors, the survivors fleeing in disarray. A skirmish that should have been a footnote became legend. But Covadonga's true power lay not in its body count, it was the unshakable symbol it became. For the scattered Christian kingdoms of Iberia, demoralized by decades of defeat, Pelagius' stand proved the Umayyads weren't invincible. His makeshift kingdom of Asturias, no larger than a modern county, became the kernel from which the Reconquista would grow. Like a single ember spared from a smoldering fire, this tiny resistance nurtured a flame of identity, the idea that Iberia could still belong to those who'd inherited its soil. The irony is profound. The Umayyads at the height of their power barely noticed this setback, just another minor revolt in a restive province, yet history often turns on such overlooked moments. Pelagius didn't live to see his descendants expand Asturias into Leon and Castile, or the slow, centuries-long push southward. But his choice to fight when flight seemed wiser reminds us that movements aren't born from certainty, they are born from the courage to act without it. 600 years later, when Ferdinand and Isabella finally reclaimed Granada, they traced their lineage and their legitimacy back to that defiant stand in the mountains. Covadonga teaches us that the greatest turning points sometimes wear the guise of hopeless last stands, because when the world seems destined to bow before an unstoppable force, the bravest thing one can do is plant their feet and whisper, "No. Not here, not today." The Venetian galleys cut through the Bosporus currents like knives in the spring of 1204, their sails taut with ill-gotten wind. What had begun as a holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem had twisted into something darker. A crusade turned inward, its blades pointed not at Muslim strongholds but at the heart of Christian Byzantium itself. The decision to enforce a naval blockade on Constantinople wasn't just a betrayal. It was the moment Venice's merchant princes proved that gold could outweigh God. Doge Enrico Dandolo, the blind octogenarian who ruled Venice with a banker's cunning, saw an opportunity too lucrative to ignore. The Crusaders, stranded without ships after failing to pay their debts, became pawns in his scheme. Withholding their promised transport unless they helped sack Zara, a Christian city, was the first sin, but diverting them toward Constantinople under the pretense of restoring a deposed prince. That was the masterstroke. Imagine the horror of Byzantine citizens watching their supposed allies transform into besiegers, Venetian war machines pounding the very walls that had shielded Christendom from Eastern invasions for centuries. The short-term gains seemed dazzling. Venice claimed 3/8 of the empire's carcass, including the coveted harbor of Crete. Crusaders stuffed their coffers with looted relics and melted down mosaics. But the true cost unfolded like slow poison. Byzantium never fully recovered. Its authority fractured into competing Greek rump states. The sack didn't just weaken Eastern Orthodoxy, it planted the seeds for Islam's eventual dominance in Anatolia, as the crippled empire could no longer hold the line against Turkish expansion. Worst of all, the schism between Catholic and Orthodox churches deepened into a chasm of mutual hatred. Centuries later, when the Ottomans finally breached Constantinople's walls in 1453, there would be no united Christian response, only bitter recriminations over who bore responsibility for the empire's vulnerability. Venice's merchant lords never grasped the irony. Their greed had undermined the very civilization that kept their eastern trade routes safe. The lesson of 1204 isn't just about treachery, it's about the illusion of quick wins. Venice's wealth swelled, but at what cost? Like a man burning his house for warmth, the Crusaders and their financiers gained a fleeting comfort while ensuring their own long-term ruin. History whispers a warning through those scorched Byzantine streets. When profit eclipses principle, even the richest victory can leave you bankrupt in ways no coin can measure. The walls of Calais groaned under the weight of starvation in the summer of 1347. Its French defenders reduced to chewing leather and boiling weeds after nearly a year of English siege. Inside the city, Governor Jean de Vienne faced an impossible choice: order his skeletal garrison to fight to the last breath, or open the gates to Edward III's victorious army. The decision to surrender wasn't just a military calculation, it was a moral reckoning that would echo through the ages. What happened next wasn't the chivalric mercy medieval chroniclers loved to romanticize. Edward, furious at the prolonged resistance, demanded 6 burghers, the wealthiest citizens, kneel before him with nooses around their necks as the price for sparing the town. This wasn't merely punishment, it was theater designed to break the spirit of French resistance. The image of those 6 men, barefoot and holding the city's keys, became one of history's most haunting tableaus. Only the dramatic intervention of Queen Philippa, pleading on her knees for their lives, turned Edward's wrath into reluctant clemency. The true significance of Calais lies not in the surrender itself, but in what it revealed about the shifting nature of medieval warfare. Unlike earlier conflicts where noble captives were ransomed and commoners overlooked, Edward treated the entire city as a single entity to be punished or spared. His actions blurred the line between soldier and civilian, setting a precedent that would darken European sieges for centuries to come. The burghers' near execution sent a chilling message. Collective suffering could now be weaponized as psychological warfare. Yet the aftermath held an even more surprising twist. Though Edward expelled most French citizens, his decision to repopulate Calais with English merchants transformed it into a bustling trade hub, a strategic toehold on the continent England would cling to for over 200 years. The very act meant to humiliate France accidentally created an economic bridge between enemies, proving that even the bitterest conflicts can birth unintended connections. Calais teaches us that surrender is never just an ending, it's the first move in a new, more complex game. The defender's choice to live and rebuild rather than die gloriously reminds us that survival itself can be an act of defiance. And sometimes history's most pivotal moments aren't marked by the clash of swords, but by the quiet courage of those who choose to endure. The midday sun blazed over the rocky hills of Ain Jalut in September 1260, the air thick with the scent of dust and fear. For weeks, the Mongol general Kitbuka had pursued the retreating Mamluk forces deeper into Palestine, confident that no army could withstand the thunder of his horsemen. But the Mamluks weren't fleeing, they were weaving a trap with the precision of master falconers. Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant Lieutenant Baybars had chosen this battlefield carefully, a narrow valley where Mongol mobility would mean nothing, where the very terrain would become their executioner. When the moment came, it unfolded with terrifying efficiency. Mamluk cavalry feigned panic, luring Kitbuka's vanguard into the valley's deadly embrace. Then, like a gate slamming shut, hidden forces surged from the surrounding hills, cutting off retreat while mounted archers rained death from above. The Mongols, accustomed to dictating the terms of engagement, found themselves trapped in a slaughterhouse of their own making. Kitbuka fought like a cornered lion, but the outcome was never in doubt. His severed head would later be paraded through Damascus as proof that the unstoppable had finally been stopped. What made Ain Jalut earth-shaking wasn't just the battle itself, it was the illusion it shattered. For decades, the Mongols had cultivated an aura of invincibility, their conquests stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. Kings and caliphs had surrendered at the mere rumor of their approach. Yet here, in this forgotten valley, the Mamluks demonstrated a revolutionary truth. Even empires built on terror have their breaking point. Their victory didn't just save Cairo from becoming another smoldering entry in the Mongol chronicles. It preserved the cultural heart of Islam at its most vulnerable moment. The aftermath rippled across continents. The Mongol Ilkhanate, humiliated, turned its ambitions elsewhere, leaving the Middle East to flourish under Mamluk rule. Meanwhile, Baybars, the real architect of the victory, would later seize power and transform Egypt into a fortress capable of repelling Crusaders and Mongols alike. But the most enduring lesson lies deeper than tactics or territory. Ain Jalut proved that history's tide can turn on a single, well-placed strike, not just against an army, but against the myth of inevitability itself. 6 centuries later, military strategists still study this battle as the ultimate case study in turning an opponent's strength into weakness. The Mongols' legendary mobility became their coffin in that cramped valley, their reputation for invincibility now a liability that blinded them to danger. There's a haunting relevance to that lesson today. The moment we assume any force is unstoppable is the moment we stop looking for its vulnerabilities. The Mamluks didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they were the first to truly believe the Mongols could bleed. And sometimes that shift in perception is all it takes to redraw the map of the world. The snowstorm howled across the fields of Narva in November 1700, reducing visibility to mere feet as 20,000 Swedish soldiers prepared to do the unthinkable. Their king, 18-year-old Charles XII, had just made a decision that defied all military logic: attack immediately, despite being outnumbered nearly 4-1 by Peter the Great's fortified Russian army. Most commanders would have waited for the blizzard to pass, or better yet, retreated. But Charles saw opportunity in the chaos, whispering to his generals words that would become legendary: "The storm is our ally." What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in turning disadvantage into weaponry. The Swedes advanced silently through the whirling snow, their blue and yellow uniforms blending into the whiteout until they were practically on top of the Russian trenches. The defenders, confident behind their earthworks, never saw the onslaught coming. Swedish pikemen and grenadiers surged over the ramparts like ghosts materializing from the storm itself, their sudden appearance sparking panic. Within hours, the Russian line collapsed, entire regiments trampling each other in their frantic retreat across the frozen Narva River. By nightfall, 10,000 Russians lay dead or captured, their artillery and supplies abandoned, all while the blizzard continued to rage, as if nature itself had taken Sweden's side. Charles' victory at Narva resonated far beyond its immediate impact. It proved that psychological shock could neutralize even the most overwhelming numerical advantage, a lesson medieval commanders from William the Conqueror to Joan of Arc would have recognized instantly. The Russians had expected a conventional siege. Instead, they were handed a nightmare scenario where visibility, communication, and cohesion vanished in the snow. The young king's genius lay in understanding that sometimes the boldest move isn't flanking or feinting, it's refusing to let your enemy predict you at all. Yet the battle's true significance lies in its echoes of an older martial ethos. Charles' tactics, relying on speed, surprise, and sheer audacity, were straight from the medieval playbook, reminiscent of Viking winter raids or Swiss ambushes in alpine passes. In an age where firearms and artillery were making warfare increasingly impersonal, Narva was a fleeting reminder that human factors, courage, timing, the willingness to gamble everything, still dictated outcomes. Peter the Great would later modernize Russia's army partly in response to this humiliation, but even his reforms couldn't erase the lesson. No technological edge outweighs the element of surprise, and no fortifications can defend against a commander who turns the weather itself into a weapon. There's a poetic irony to Narva's legacy. Though fought in the early modern era, it stands as a bridge between two worlds, the last glorious gasp of medieval daring before industrialized warfare rendered such gambits obsolete. Charles himself would spend the rest of his life chasing that same lightning in a bottle brilliance, ultimately meeting his downfall chasing impossible odds. But for one frozen afternoon, as snowflakes swirled around Swedish banners planted in captured earthworks, the clock seemed to turn backward. A teenage king had proven that sometimes history still bows to those brave enough to charge straight into the storm. The frozen fields outside Nancy shimmered under a pale winter sun in January 1477, but the true chill lay in Charles the Bold's unshaken confidence. His Burgundian army, though outnumbered and exhausted from months of campaigning, still moved with the rigid precision that had once made them the envy of Europe. Across the icy terrain, Swiss pikemen advanced in their signature deep squares, a formation Charles had faced before, and one he was certain he could break. That certainty would be his last mistake. For years, Charles had clung to the same battle plan: heavy cavalry charges supported by artillery, a formula that had served his ancestors well. But warfare had evolved, and the Swiss were its ruthless new architects. When his knights thundered forward, their lances leveled for a killing strike, the Swiss didn't scatter. They tightened ranks, their pikes forming an impenetrable thicket that skewered horses and riders alike. Charles, watching from a nearby hill, refused to adjust. Again and again, he ordered fresh waves of cavalry into the grinder, as if sheer determination could bend reality to his will. The Swiss, sensing his fixation, began flanking his battered forces, their mobility and adaptability turning the battle into a slaughterhouse. The collapse came swiftly. Charles, his ornate armor now a liability in the retreat, was cornered near a frozen creek and struck down by a Swiss halberd. The man who dreamed of forging a kingdom between France and Germany died nameless in the snow, his face so mutilated that his body was only identified by his manicured nails and old battle scars. In that single afternoon, Burgundy's golden age crumbled. Its lands were carved up by rivals, its wealth dispersed, its very memory reduced to a cautionary tale. What makes Nancy so haunting isn't just the fall of a duke, it's the anatomy of his downfall. Charles didn't lack courage or resources. He lacked the one trait that defines all great commanders: the ability to unlearn. While his Swiss foes constantly refined their tactics, he fought the last war, not the one in front of him. His stubbornness wasn't just a personal flaw, it was institutional. Burgundy's entire military doctrine had fossilized, its leaders mistaking tradition for invincibility. The lesson echoes far beyond medieval battlefields. Nancy teaches us that the greatest threat to any empire, any organization, any individual isn't always external. It's the refusal to question what's always worked. The Swiss didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they were willing to change. Charles' tragedy reminds us that adaptability isn't just a strategy, it's the oxygen of survival. And sometimes the deadliest thing a leader can hear isn't retreat, but this is how we've always done it. The moon hung like a pale sickle over Nicopolis in the autumn of 1396, casting just enough light to reveal the silhouettes of Hungarian knights tightening their gauntlets. King Sigismund's Crusader army, a patchwork of European nobility and mercenaries, had marched for months to confront the Ottoman menace. Now, camped within sight of Sultan Bayezid's forces, the Hungarians faced a choice: wait for dawn to coordinate with their Wallachian allies, or strike immediately under cover of darkness. Impatience won. What followed wasn't just a failed assault, it was a masterclass in how desperation can masquerade as daring. The Hungarian heavy cavalry charged blindly into the Ottoman positions, their lances gleaming in the torchlight. At first, the chaos seemed to favor them. Bayezid's janissaries reeled from the sudden onslaught, but the Ottomans had prepared for this exact scenario. Hidden archers unleashed volleys from the flanks, while the Sultan's elite Sipahi cavalry funneled the knights into a killing zone littered with caltrops and trenches. By midnight, the Crusaders' formation had dissolved into scattered pockets of resistance, their initial advantage squandered by lack of reconnaissance or coordination. The real tragedy lay in what might have been. Had Sigismund waited for his Wallachian reinforcements under Prince Mercia, the old seasoned warriors who knew the terrain intimately, the outcome could have rewritten Balkan history. Instead, Nicopolis became a cautionary tale about the illusion of momentum. The Hungarians mistook the euphoria of a surprise attack for tactical superiority, failing to recognize that darkness favors prepared defenders as much as bold attackers. Bayezid, ever the strategist, had anticipated their impulsiveness and turned it into a weapon against them. In the aftermath, the Ottomans solidified their grip on the Danube, while Europe's nobility learned a painful lesson about the difference between bravery and recklessness. Nicopolis didn't just mark another Crusader defeat, it exposed a generational divide in warfare. The old chivalric code, where honor demanded headlong charges, collided with the Ottomans' disciplined pragmatism. The knights' fatal flaw wasn't lack of courage, it was their refusal to adapt to an enemy who fought with patience as well as steel. Centuries later, military historians still cite Nicopolis as the moment medieval warfare's romantic ideals met their brutal reckoning. The Hungarians' night attack holds up a mirror to all who confuse action with strategy, a reminder that the darkest battles aren't always fought in daylight, but in the shadow of our own unchecked assumptions. Sometimes the bravest thing a leader can do isn't swinging the sword, but knowing when to let the stars fade before giving the order. The midsummer heat shimmered over the rocky plains of Los Navas de Tolosa in 1212, where Alfonso VIII of Castile stood at the head of the most unlikely coalition in medieval Spanish history, Christian kings who'd spent more years warring against each other than against their common Almohad foe. For decades, the Berber Empire had tightened its grip on Iberia, its fanatical warriors sweeping northward until only a sliver of Christendom remained. Now, as the Almohad Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir marshaled an army twice their size, Alfonso faced a choice that would define the peninsula's future: retreat to defend their fractured kingdoms separately, or stand together in a single, desperate gamble. His decision to unite the banners of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and even long hostile Leon under one cause didn't just defy political logic, it forged a sword from broken fragments. What unfolded that July morning was less a battle than a seismic collision of worlds. The Christian forces, guided by a local shepherd through a hidden mountain pass, emerged like ghosts behind Almohad lines, their sudden appearance sparking panic. But the real miracle wasn't terrain or tactics, it was the coalition's unprecedented cohesion. Knights who'd once dueled for borderlands now fought shoulder to shoulder, their rivalries drowned out by the thunder of hooves and the collective roar of Santiago. As they crashed into the Caliph's elite Black Guard, the Almohads, accustomed to exploiting Christian divisions, found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy that had discovered, however briefly, the power of unity. By dusk, the field ran red with Berber blood, their vaunted war drums silent amidst the wreckage of tents and standards. Los Navas de Tolosa's true significance lay not in its body count, but in its psychological aftershocks. The myth of Almohad invincibility shattered like glass under a warhammer. Within decades, their empire would crumble, its fragments picked apart by Christian kingdoms now emboldened to push southward with renewed vigor. Yet the battle's deeper lesson transcends medieval geopolitics. Alfonso's coalition proved that the most formidable walls aren't made of stone, but of division, and that even the bitterest rivals can become unstoppable when they choose common purpose over old grievances. The irony is piercing. This fleeting alliance born of existential terror achieved what a century of crusading rhetoric couldn't: a tangible shift in Iberia's destiny. Modern leaders still study Los Navas as a masterclass in coalition building, though few grasp its uncomfortable truth. Unity forged in crisis often dissolves once the danger passes. The Christian kings returned to their squabbles soon after, yet the echo of their brief solidarity lingered. Like lightning scorching a path through dry brush, Their combined strength at Los Navas carved a channel for the Reconquista's final surge, proving that history sometimes pivots not on grand ideologies, but on the simple, radical act of choosing to stand together, if only for one sun-scorched day. The crisp September air carried the scent of damp earth and steel as Harold Hardrada's Viking army formed their shield wall near Stamford Bridge, their confidence as unshaken as the ancient oaks surrounding them. Days earlier, they'd crushed the northern English earls at Fulford, and now only a ragged force led by King Harold Godwinson stood between them and total victory. Yet as the English host appeared on the horizon, glinting in the late afternoon sun, the Norwegian king made a choice that would etch his name into legend and seal his fate. Whether by arrogance or a warrior's pride, Harold allegedly cast aside his protective armor, declaring he'd fight, bare as the bears of his homeland. It was a gesture worthy of sagas, but one that ignored the brutal pragmatism of medieval combat. What happened next was less a battle than a brutal lesson in the cost of overconfidence. The English, hardened by years of border skirmishes, didn't fight like the defeated nobles at Fulford. They fought like men defending their homeland, their axes and spears carving through the Viking ranks with terrifying efficiency. Harold, his towering frame unmistakable even amid the chaos, became a magnet for English blades. The legendary warrior who'd served as a Varangian guard in Constantinople, who'd carved a kingdom from the frozen north, fell not to some equally mythic foe, but to an anonymous arrow, or perhaps a well-aimed spear thrust, his unprotected body offering no resistance. His death didn't just collapse Norwegian morale, it unraveled an invasion that had come agonizingly close to rewriting England's destiny. The irony cuts deep. Had Harold survived that bridge, his seasoned army might have weathered Harold Godwinson's assault, leaving England weakened and divided when William of Normandy landed weeks later. Instead, Stamford Bridge became a Pyrrhic victory. The English forces, though triumphant, were so depleted that their stand at Hastings became a desperate last gasp rather than an even fight. Harold's decision to disdain armor wasn't just a personal miscalculation. It inadvertently paved the way for Norman conquest. Yet there's a deeper truth to this story than the dangers of hubris. Harold's choice reflects the Viking ethos in its twilight, a world where personal glory still outweighed self-preservation, where reputation mattered more than longevity. In sagas, such moments are celebrated. On real battlefields, they're often just tragic. His death marked more than the end of a king. It symbolized the close of an era when individual bravery could still sway the tides of history. The Normans, with their chainmail-clad cavalry and ruthless discipline, represented the future. Harold, for all his brilliance, belonged to the past, a fact as undeniable as the blood soaking the grass beneath Stamford Bridge. Perhaps that's why this moment lingers in our collective memory. It's not just a cautionary tale about pride, but a poignant farewell to the age of warrior kings. The bridge itself, whether crossed in armor or without, became a threshold between worlds, one that Harold strode across without looking back, and in doing so, left history to march onward without him. Consider the weight of a single choice, how a commander's split-second hesitation or a king's stubborn resolve could redraw the map of continents. These 26 battlefield decisions didn't just win or lose battles. They forged empires, toppled dynasties, and rewrote the cultural DNA of Europe and beyond. When William the Conqueror burned his ships at Pevensey, he didn't just secure a beachhead, he severed England from its Anglo-Saxon past, grafting Norman law, language, and architecture onto the island's identity. Centuries later, the consequences still echo in the vaulted ceilings of Westminster and the French-rooted words on our tongues, but the ripple effects weren't always so visible in the moment. Take the Swiss peasants at Morgarten, whose pike formations shattered knightly dominance. Their victory didn't just preserve Alpine independence, it heralded the decline of feudalism itself, proving that disciplined commoners could overpower aristocratic elites. Across the Mediterranean, Saladin's mercy at Jaffa reverberated through the Crusades, showing that even holy war had room for honor. These weren't isolated events, they were hinges upon which history swung, each one nudging the medieval world toward modernity. Some choices unraveled whole civilizations. The Fourth Crusade's betrayal at Constantinople didn't just sack a city, it crippled Byzantium, leaving Europe's eastern flank vulnerable to Ottoman expansion. Meanwhile, the Mongols' feigned retreats at Kalka River didn't merely win battles, they rewrote the rules of warfare, proving psychological terror could be deadlier than steel. Yet for every tactical masterstroke, there were miscalculations that collapsed like dominoes. Charles the Bold's refusal to adapt at Nancy, or the Hungarian knight's reckless charge at Nicopolis, both sacrifices to outdated pride. What makes these moments so mesmerizing isn't their scale, but their fragility. Had Joan of Arc hesitated at Orléans, France might never have coalesced into a unified kingdom. If Richard the Lionheart had slaughtered his prisoners at Jaffa, the Crusade's legacy might be one of unrelenting brutality. These forks in the road remind us that history isn't some inevitable march, it's a mosaic of human decisions, each one trembling with alternate possibilities. The medieval world we study today wasn't foreordained. It was built, battle by battle, on the courage, cunning, and sometimes catastrophic blunders of those who stood where the blade met the bone. So the next time you trace a border on a map or marvel at a cathedral's soaring arches, remember, behind them lies a chain of choices made in dust and blood. The past isn't a static tapestry, it's a story still breathing, stitched together by the threads of countless what-ifs. And somewhere in those echoes, we find the most humbling lesson of all. The future, too, will be shaped not by fate, but by the decisions we make when the stakes are highest. The medieval battlefield was more than just a stage for clashing armies. It was a pressure cooker where the smallest choices could tilt the balance of history. Think of it like a grand, brutal chessboard where every move carried consequences far beyond the blood-soaked ground where they were made. These 26 turning points we've explored reveal something timeless. That leadership isn't just about strength or strategy, but about understanding the weight of a single moment. William the Conqueror's burning ships, Joan of Arc's unshakable faith, Saladin's unexpected mercy, each of these wasn't just a tactical decision, but a window into the human soul under unimaginable strain. What's striking isn't just the outcomes, but the sheer diversity of these choices. Some, like Charles the Bold's fatal stubbornness at Nancy, warn us about the dangers of refusing to adapt. Others, like the Swiss peasants turning farm tools into weapons at Morgarten, show how creativity can overturn centuries of tradition. And then there are the quieter, more profound moments, Richard the Lionheart sparing prisoners at Jaffa, proving that even in war, our humanity doesn't have to be the first casualty. These stories shatter the myth that history is shaped only by vast, impersonal forces. Instead, they remind us that individuals flawed, courageous, and utterly human steer the course of events in ways no one can predict. There's a lesson here that transcends swords and siege engines. The medieval commanders who changed the world weren't just brilliant tacticians. They were masters of reading the invisible currents of morale, timing, and chance. They understood that victory often goes not to the strongest army, but to the one that dares to rewrite the rules. The Mongols didn't conquer half the known world because they had better weapons. They did it because they fought like no one else imagined possible. The Templars at Acre didn't save lives because they were ordered to. They chose to, turning their final moments into something far more enduring than any battlefield triumph. So what does this mean for us today? These stories aren't just relics of a distant past, they're mirrors. They force us to ask ourselves how we respond when the stakes are high and the clock is ticking. Would we have the clarity of Jan Žižka, turning wagons into fortresses when all seemed lost? The restraint of Saladin, who knew when to sheathe his sword? Or might we falter like the French at Crécy, clinging to outdated ideas while the world changes around us? History doesn't judge these choices as right or wrong. It simply records their ripple effects, showing us how fragile and extraordinary our shared story really is. As the dust settles on these battlefields, one truth stands clear: the past isn't fixed. It's a tapestry woven from countless threads of decision and chance. And if there's a single takeaway from these 26 turning points, it's this: the future belongs to those who understand that every choice, no matter how small, carries the weight of what might be. So the next time you face a crossroads, big or small, remember the echoes of these medieval moments. After all, the battles of tomorrow will be won by those who have learned from the choices of the past. If this journey through history's most pivotal decisions resonated with you, let's keep the conversation going. Drop a like if you found it enlightening, subscribe to uncover more stories where the past comes alive, and share in the comments: what medieval decision would you want to witness firsthand? Your engagement helps bring these forgotten moments back into the light. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, history isn't just about what happened, it's about what could have been.